We are back again with On the Money Line, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here again at the Apex in Vegas for the absolutely stacked UFC 259. And stacked is actually an understatement here. When you have Dominick, Cruz and Joe Benavidez on the prelims, you know you're about to be given an absolute treat. And that's exactly what we have here with the triple header of championship fights, along with a champion versus champion fight too. We have a light heavyweight title fight with the champion Jan Blachowicz versus the undefeated UFC middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. Then we have the women's featherweight championship on the line between the women's MMA greatest of all time Amanda Nunes versus Megan Anderson. And if that isn't enough, we have one of the greatest bantamweight championship fights of all time as we get Petr Yan versus Aljamain Sterling. This is going to be insane. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there are a few things to mention in regards to MMAPlay365. Last weekend was a very mixed night across the board. We did drop on Alexander Hernandez and Jimmy Rivera, but we did cash on one of the newest prospects in the UFC, Ronnie Lawrence, who looked like a minus 300 favourite out there. 50% of the fun parlay pieces won, and the dog of the week was actually Montana De La Rosa, which ended in a draw. So yeah, a very mixed and strange event as a whole. Remember, we have multiple betting packages on the MMAPlay365 website for all the UFC betting advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights. In the main event, we've got the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship on the line between the champion Jan Blachowicz and the UFC Middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. It's actually Adesanya that's the favourite here at minus 230, with the comeback on Blachowicz at plus 190 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that there's slight value with Israel Adesanya, if I'm being honest. He was a bigger favourite just a couple of days ago. I didn't see too much value there, but the money is coming in on Blachowicz, and the more money that comes in, I do think that Adesanya is the value side here. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, as I've just mentioned, the money comes in on Jan Blachowicz. He was a bigger underdog just a couple of days ago. I do think that trend continues, but I only think it'll go so far. I'd be very surprised to see Adesanya below the minus 200 line. And when both of these fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I do think it's going to be Adesanya at minus 200 or minus 205, minus 210, around that sort of line. But as for how this fight plays out, it's a really interesting fight, and one of the most intriguing parts of it is Adesanya stepping up to light heavyweight. He wasn't a big middleweight. He's weighed in lower than the middleweight limit before, and actually for this fight, obviously it's at 205 pounds. I'd be very surprised if Adesanya hit that 205 mark, and I think he's going to weigh in at around 200 pounds, and Jan Blachowicz will make the 205 limit, but by the time he steps into the cage, he's going to be much heavier than that. So there's definitely going to be a huge size advantage for Jan Blachowicz here, and with that will come a big strength advantage, a big power advantage. So those are his advantages in this fight, and if he can start sitting down on his punches, if he can start cracking Adesanya hard, who knows how Adesanya is going to react being hit by a much bigger and a much more powerful fighter inside the cage. But hitting Adesanya is easier said than done. For a start, there's an argument that Adesanya is the most elite striker in the UFC. I'd definitely put him up there with guys like John Jones, Wonderboy. I know that sounds crazy, but Wonderboy's striking is really elusive, really unique, and that's what we get with Israel Adesanya. And the one advantage that he's had in that middleweight division is that he does come in a little bit lighter, and he uses his speed and his movement, and he wins fights based off that speed, that movement, being able to react much quicker than his opponent. And when we're talking about technical striking, Jan Blachowicz is a technical striker for sure, but Adesanya is just levels above the technical striking that Jan Blachowicz presents in this fight, and that, to me, is going to give Adesanya significant advantages. For me, it's quite simple in regards to, if this fight goes to a decision, I just think Adesanya's movement, his speed, and his volume that he puts out is going to put him ahead on the scorecards, on the numbers, and honestly, I do struggle to see Blachowicz winning a decision here unless he can score takedowns, get on top, hold Adesanya down, because if Blachowicz does get on top of Adesanya, he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. As I've already mentioned, he's going to be bigger, stronger, he'll be heavier on top, and again, that might be a problem for Adesanya. He might not be able to get back up, but taking Adesanya down is going to be difficult because of that movement. He's awareness of danger, and his scrambling ability to get back up to his feet has looked good from the small sample size that we've seen in the UFC so far. So I do think that this fight is going to be a fight that's won and lost on the feet. I do think that Jan has every chance of catching Adesanya with a big hard punch to the face that knocks him out. If Blachowicz can get in on body shots as well and maybe wear Adesanya down again, that's a possibility. But I do think the low percentage outcomes, again, like I've already mentioned, because Adesanya can be so hard to hit, and although he's at a massive size and strength and power disadvantage here, he's got huge advantages in that speed and movement, and I think that's going to be a key factor in this fight. I do think it's a possibility Jan knocks him out, but I think it's a greater possibility that Adesanya puts on a clinic here. If this fight is a high volume affair, then I favour Adesanya. And also if it's a low volume affair, I also favour Adesanya, because low volume is going to mean that Adesanya's on the back foot, darting in and out of range, lateral movement, staying safe and only striking when he needs to, a little bit like the Yoel Romero fight. So in that scenario, I still favour Adesanya. I'm not sure if Adesanya can finish Blachowicz. He's tough, he's durable, and I'm just not sure that Adesanya is going to have that power at light heavyweight to really put somebody like Blachowicz out. But I do think that Adesanya does style in this fight. I do think he's going to look good, and if he doesn't get knocked out, he is going to win this fight. I don't think that Adesanya gets knocked out, and for that reason I'm picking Israel Adesanya to win this fight. I'm picking Israel Adesanya to be the latest UFC champ and new. And in the next fight, we've got the Women's Featherweight Championship on the line with the Women's MMA GOAT Amanda Nunes versus Megan Anderson. Nunes is currently the minus 1165 favourite. The comeback on Anderson at plus 750 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, at minus 1165, it's difficult to say that there's value with Amanda Nunes there. That betting line is just so high, and it's always risky playing those sort of wide lines. And I do think Nunes justifies it 100%, but it's just, what if Nunes takes a misstep, rolls her ankle? What if she injures herself and Megan Anderson is allowed to start expressing herself and looking good? These are all very rare occurrences, but they're all possibilities as well. And for that reason, I would probably look at a potential prop bet to try and get value in Nunes. I don't see value on the money line, but I do think it's justified at the same time. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there is a bit of fluctuation here, which I quite understand if I'm being honest, because Nunes is going to be in a lot of parlays, and as I always mention, parlays will increase and widen that betting line. But I also feel that a lot of people are just seeing plus 750 and thinking, do you know what, it's worth a little bit of money, even if it's only beer money. But again, if a lot of people think like that, if a lot of people have got that train of thought, then that can bring the line down a little bit. So there is a little bit of fluctuation. I do understand it from both sides. And when these two women step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, I think a lot of these breakdowns are going to be really similar with Amanda Nunes. I just don't see her losing this fight. I don't see an area where Megan Anderson is better, where she has an advantage. It's just a really tough fight, and it's not Megan Anderson's fault. Amanda Nunes is just so good, and there's just nobody out there right now that can really push Amanda Nunes and test her. Eventually she is going to get caught, she is going to lose, and when she does lose, I've said it time and time again, it's going to be one of these betting lines where she is minus 1165 right now, or minus 1200, or minus 1500. So she is going to lose at some point, but I don't think it's this fight. I think in regards to the striking, Nunes is the more technical striker. She's got more power, she's more aggressive, her movement's better, she's got more volume. In regards to the wrestling and the grappling, I don't see Anderson being able to take Nunes down. If anybody's going to take somebody down, I think it's going to be Nunes taking Anderson down. And if Anderson does surprise Nunes with her striking, because Anderson is a striker, then I could just see Nunes getting a body lock, tripping her, taking her down, and then rolling on top. And when we're talking about the grappling and jiu-jitsu, again, Nunes is just levels above here too. As I've mentioned already numerous times, I think it's a really difficult fight for Anderson. I think that if the fight stays standing, I think Nunes will shine here. I think she's got the potential to knock Anderson out as well. If it becomes a clinch battle or a ground battle and the jiu-jitsu and the wrestling kicks in, then I think Nunes is going to win there as well. The path to victory for Megan Anderson here would be just to catch Nunes, her to potentially knock her out, but again, that's going to be so low percentage, and there is always that possibility with MMA, but I really don't see it happening. I think Nunes just shines wherever this fight goes, so I'm picking Amanda Nunes to win the fight and remain the UFC Women's Featherweight Champion, and still And in the next fight, as I mentioned in the introduction to this episode, we have one of the greatest UFC Bantamweight Championship fights of all time. This fight is phenomenal. We've got Petr versus Aljamain Sterling. Yan is currently the -115 favourite. The comeback on Sterling, the slight underdog at -105. As for where the value is on the betting line though, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Sterling at -105. It's not crazy value there, but value nonetheless. Either way though, I think if you've got a good read on this fight, both sides are playable because Petr is a beast, he's a monster himself, so if you've got a good read on Yan at -115, that's 100% playable for sure. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, the current trend is the money coming in on Sterling. Yan opened at -145, Sterling around +125, and all that money is coming on Sterling to push this fight close to a pick'em, and it is actually a pick'em in some places as well. So I do think that current trend will halt a little bit. I do think the public is seeing this fight as a very even fight, so I expect both fighters to step in the cage on Saturday night with this fight at a dead even -110 pick'em. As for how the fight plays out though, it's a really intriguing fight because you've got Petr, who is a striker through and through. Sure, he's got wrestling and grappling abilities as well. You don't become a UFC champion if you don't have those qualities, but Yan is a striker, predominantly a boxer. He likes to land hard combinations on the feet. He gets inside the boxing range really well and lets rip with those combinations to the head, to the body, and he's a nightmare and he hits really hard for his size as well. The problem that I have with Yan and his striking though is the range. He only seems to be really efficient inside of that boxing range, and sure, he can fire kicks from the outside and he can fire jabs, he's got nice fundamentals, but it's inside boxing range where he really gets the majority of his good work done. And in fights where he can't get into boxing range easily, or in fights where he's having to make reads to get into that boxing range, he can be a little inactive on the feet. His opponents can start to tee off on him from the outside and just start racking up the numbers in volume. And it's that sort of inactivity that I don't like. Now, if Yan can get inside of Sterling and really start boxing him up, and if he can get inside that boxing range often, then Sterling is either going to get knocked out or he's in for a very long night. But the movement of Aljamain Sterling, that funky, unorthodox movement, in and out of range, lateral movement, I think is going to be very difficult to read in this fight. And it's actually going to help him because the longer he can remain a little unpredictable, the longer he keeps up this funky, unorthodox movement, the harder it's going to be for Yan to actually get into that boxing range, get off on volume, or even sit down on punches and land something hard on Sterling. I love Yan. I think he's an absolute monster. I think he runs through so many fighters in the division, but styles make fights, and I just feel that although Sterling is absolutely nowhere near Yan in regards to the technical ability on the feet, Sterling does his own thing inside the cage. He does enough to create volume for himself, remain active, front kicks to the middle, low kicks, spin attacks, just being able to keep his distance and being very aware of danger coming towards him, and I think that's going to pose the problems to Yan. I don't think that Sterling is going to get up on hundreds of numbers here. I don't think the striking differential is going to be absolutely crazy, but I do think Sterling's going to do enough in this fight on the feet to bamboozle Yan a little bit, confuse him a little bit, and make him inactive whilst he's trying to read Aljo, whilst he's trying to get into that range. And that's going to be the problem. Then when you've got the wrestling and the grappling side of things, I don't think Yan's easy to take down, although he can be taken down. I don't think Sterling's got the best takedown offense, but again, he can score takedowns. If he does fail on that initial entry, Sterling will push a fighter up to the cage. He'll get a body lock. He'll try and trip them down to the mat, or he'll try and hop the back and do what he did to Sandhagen. And once he's on the mat, he's an absolute nightmare to deal with. He's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Matt Serra, so that's a legit black belt. And I do think that if this fight hits the mat, this is where Sterling has got the greatest advantage for himself in this fight. I do think that the fight hits the mat. I'm not sure that Sterling gets him out of there like he did with Sandhagen, especially how quickly he got him out of there, but Sterling's going to be able to control positions on the mat. He's going to be able to establish some top control, and I think that's where he's going to shine the most in this fight. Whilst the fight's on the feet, Yan's got every single chance of knocking him out, but again, I do think that Aljo is the better round winner here. We've seen Yan drop rounds because of that inactivity, which I've spoken about a few times already. And when you look at the numbers, look at how much Sterling's actually hit on the feet striking. He's hit 1.94 times per minute on average, which must be one of the lowest averages in the UFC. So that's definitely something to be aware of. However, if any fighter can put a dent in that average at 1.94 strikes per minute, it is going to be someone like Petr to close the distance and rip combinations. Like I said, that's Jan's path to victory. If he can get into that range enough over 3 rounds, then he should either knock Aljo out or he'll win a decision. But to be honest with you, when I'm looking at this fight and who wins and where it plays out, I think Aljo's got more paths to victory. I think Aljo's got more potential game plans because he could stay on the feet and make it a striking affair and play that out at distance, frustrate Petr. But I also think that there's a path to victory with the wrestling and grappling as well. And when I couple this with the fact that I believe Aljamain Sterling is the fighter more likely to win rounds, the better round winner here, as an analyst breaking fights down, it's just hard for me to not favour Aljamain Sterling in this fight. And for that reason, I am picking Aljamain Sterling to become the new UFC bantamweight champion. And in the next fight, we've got Islam Makhachev versus Drew Dober. Makhachev is currently the -335 favourite. The comeback on Dober at +275 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, on the money line itself with Makhachev at -335, I really don't think he should be a -335 favourite if I'm being honest. I'm not shocked that he is the favourite. Obviously, Islam Makhachev is an absolute beast, Dagestani-born Russian. His style is the closest that we've ever seen in the UFC to Khabib Nurmagomedov, so I totally understand why he's the favourite, but Drew Dober certainly has his advantages in this fight for me. And at +275, if you're asking me to pick a value side on the money line, I think there's more value in the +275 of Dober than the -335 of Makhachev. And as for where this betting line moves throughout fight week, there is a little bit of money coming in on Drew Dober right now, and again, I totally understand it. I think a lot of people are thinking the same thing here. I do think that money continues to come in. I do think Makhachev falls below the -300 mark, and I do think that Makhachev will get into the cage -275, -280, but I would be surprised if it went any lower than that, if I'm being honest, because Makhachev is Makhachev. And as for how this fight plays out, I do think it's a really interesting fight, striker versus grappler for sure. Now, Islam Makhachev can strike, he's got good technical striking, and he's definitely not flawed when you look at his striking, but when you're comparing it to the striking of Drew Dober, I definitely think there's a big gap in skill there. Dober's got a lifetime of experience with Muay Thai. He was a junior champion in Muay Thai, and the guy can put his strikes together really well. He's crisp, he's sharp, he's accurate, he throws in combinations, he rips to the body, he rips to the head, and with all that, he's got power. And we've only spoken about his punching there. In regards to his kicks, he's got good low kicks, good high kicks, good body kicks. He's just a well put together and a well polished striker. So for as long as this fight stays on the feet, I do think Dober's going to be a nightmare for Makhachev. I don't think he's going to run in there and be able to put Makhachev out and knock him out very easily, because like I say, Makhachev can strike as well. He's not a flawed striker there. It's just Dober's the better striker in this instance. But where this fight really changes is in the clinch scenarios, the wrestling, the grappling, and the topside control. And unfortunately for Dober, I do think that this is where the fight is won and lost, because I believe that the moments grappling, the topside control is going to have a much bigger impact on the fight than what the striking will. And if this fight does go to the scorecards, then the judges are going to be looking at who was the more effective striker versus who was the more effective grappler. And if the majority of the better work in the fight is being done on the mat with Makhachev, which I believe it will be, then the judges are going to be scoring that fight to Makhachev. I think in this fight, Makhachev will come out, he will start to look to strike just to get a read on Dober, see how he deals with his striking, but I think very quickly he'll realise that Dober is the better striker, and that'll just force Makhachev to go more to his wrestling. Not that he ever needs that push really, but it'll force him more to go there. And once Makhachev has that urgency to go to the mat, I do think he's going to be able to score takedowns. I do think that Dober's going to be able to get up a couple of times as well. He's no slouch on the mat, but with Makhachev, he's got that grip. He'll keep that grip when his opponent's standing back up, and he'll look to take you straight back down. I think although there's a big gap in skill on the feet and the striking with the advantage to Dober, I think there's a much bigger gap in skill when it comes to the wrestling and the grappling, with the advantage obviously being towards Makhachev, and I think that's going to be really apparent in this fight. I think Makhachev will get the takedowns that he needs. I think he'll get the takedowns in numbers that he needs. I think he'll get the minutes on top that he needs. I also think that Makhachev's going to have plenty of finishing opportunities, whether that be TKO, ground and pound, or whether that be submission opportunities, looking to choke Dober out. And along with that, I think that Makhachev will be the one winning the rounds, looking better in the judges' eyes. So I do think that Makhachev's the more likely fighter to win a decision if the fight goes to the scorecards, but I also think that Makhachev's the more likely fighter to finish the fight as well, because I do think the fight is going to be won and lost with the wrestling and the grappling. So for those reasons, I'm picking Islam Makhachev to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Thiago Santos versus Aleksandar Rakic. Rakic is currently the minus 155 favourite. The comeback on Santos at plus 135 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Aleksandar Rakic at minus 155. I do think the betting line could potentially be a little bit higher, and it did open much higher. All that money's coming on Santos. So right now, I do see the value in Rakic. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, obviously, like I've just mentioned, all the money's coming on Santos. Rakic opened up at minus 265 with Santos at plus 185. Now at those odds, there ain't no value in Aleksandar Rakic. All that value is on Santos. But with the lines closing up, there is that definite trend on Thiago Santos, and I think it actually keeps coming in a little bit as well. I don't think it's going to close anywhere to a pick'em, but I wouldn't be shocked to see Rakic minus 130, minus 135 with the comeback on Santos plus 115, plus 120 come fight night on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, it's a really good fight at the top of the light heavyweight division, and one that I'm really excited for. Stylistically, I do think it favours Rakic just because he's got more paths to victory. I think he can compete with Thiago Santos on the feet, and that's the big thing here, and it's those fighters that Santos will struggle against, or one of a couple of types of fighters that Santos will struggle against. Anybody that can match Santos with his speed, his explosiveness and his power is going to have a good chance of beating him. But then when you throw in the wrestling and the topside grappling of Rakic as well, I do think it then starts to become a difficult fight for Santos. Now, I'm not saying that Santos doesn't have a path to victory here, because he does. He's powerful, he's explosive. And actually the one thing that I've always said from a negative aspect with Rakic's game, because I don't believe any fight is perfect. Every fighter's got a weakness, and I feel that Rakic's weakness is how high he holds his chin up in the air when his opponents are coming at him aggressively, and he doesn't move his head off the centre line whilst keeping his chin high as well. So he's almost just moving backwards, a little bit of that tall man defence, and punches can get through. We've seen Rakic dropped a couple of times as well. So that's the one area where I do worry for Rakic in this fight, and that's actually the one area where Santos will be able to excel in, because you saw in the Glover fight, Santos comes forward in straight lines with punches straight down the middle, followed by kicks. So if he starts kicking at the legs of Alex whilst he's moving forward, and then he starts throwing those straight punches down the pipe at Alex, then he's got every chance of knocking him out. But I just don't think that Alex is going to allow that in this fight. I think Alex is going to kick at the legs early. I think that he's going to be able to hurt the legs of Santos early as well, and that should take a lot of the power and the explosiveness and the movement out of Santos coming forward, which will definitely help Alex in the long run in this fight. But I think Alex is just going to shoot for takedowns. I think he's going to use his wrestling. He's got a great wrestling coach to help him there. He's got a phenomenal boxing coach as well that will allow him to mix things up on the feet, to disguise the takedowns and make sure that he can complete the takedowns. I know Alex obviously really well. I know his team really well. I know how he trains. I know how his mindset is and how he functions and how he works. And I just find it very difficult to think that Alex won't go into this fight and start looking for takedowns, because if he does stand with Santos, he could absolutely beat Santos on the feet in a striking war, but that gives Santos every opportunity to land that one punch or that one kick or that one combination and really hunt for his own path to victory. I think Alex is smart here. I think he will use his takedowns. I think he will establish top control, and I think he will put it on Santos on the mat in the grappling department. That's where I feel this fight's won and lost, and for that reason I'm picking Aleksandar Rakic to win this fight. And in the next fight, headlining the prelims, we've got Dominick Cruz versus Casey Kenney. Casey Kenney's actually the minus 130 favourite. The comeback on Cruz at plus 110 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Dominick Cruz. I do appreciate that he is declining, but I'm just not ready to write him off against a fighter outside of the top 15 just yet. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there has been a lot of fluctuation here. Dominick Cruz was a much bigger favourite a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days ago, but there seems to be money coming in on Cruz, and then there's money coming in on Casey. Ultimately, when these two step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the odds are going to be too far from where they're sitting right about now. And as for how the fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, Cruz is definitely declined for sure. He's not the fighter that he once was. He's not as active as he once was, and he's not the champion anymore either, and I don't think he's going to get another champion championship opportunity. But facing Casey Kenney, when you compare it to the likes of Prime Garbrandt and Henry Cejudo Triple C, it doesn't even come close into the level of competition that Cruz has been facing to what he's facing right now. Now, I actually like Casey Kenney a lot. I think he's a good fighter. He's aggressive with his striking. He comes forward. He's got good cardio. He's got good wrestling, both offensively and defensively, which should help him in this fight should Cruz start shooting for takedowns. But the bottom line is, I think he's going to have difficulties really landing on Cruz, because the one thing that I saw in that fight with Cruz and Cejudo, when I watched it first time, I thought it was a complete obliteration from Henry Cejudo. But when I watched it back, Dominick Cruz did better than I thought he did the first time I watched it. And Cruz still had that funky, weird movement, a little like what I spoke about Aljo, although Cruz is definitely more refined and it's definitely more unique. And I actually think that Kenny's going to have a lot of problems in this fight actually landing shots on Cruz, just because of the way Cruz moves. He's very difficult to read. I'd imagine he's very hard to replicate in the gym for an opponent as you're preparing for Dominick Cruz. So I think Kenney is definitely going to have moments in this fight. It's not going to be a whitewash by Cruz by any stretch of the imagination. Kenny's a really good fighter, but I think that Cruz is going to be able to get off on the numbers here. I think he's going to be able to land the better strikes. I think he's going to be the harder fighter to hit. Now, the one thing Cruz won't have in this fight that he's had in most of his fights in his career is that offensive wrestling, because one aspect I love of Casey Kenney's game is that defensive wrestling, his scrambling ability, his ability to get back up to his feet, look for mat returns, look to re-wrestle on every opportunity. We saw that in his debut against Ray Borg. So I don't think Cruz has got the explosivity, the youth and the athleticism that he once had to be able to take Kenney down and mix things up and break the fight down in that regard. So I do think that's going to be one element of Cruz's game taken away from him, but I do think that Cruz is still good enough, is still at a level to beat Casey Kenney in regards to the striking and using his movement to his advantage. So I am siding with the underdog. I'm picking Dominick Cruz to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Song Yadong versus Kyler Phillips. Yadong is currently the -135 favourite. The comeback on Phillips at +115 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I actually think the value is with the underdog again in Kyler Phillips at +115. I do think this fight should be much closer to a pick'em, and I wouldn't even argue if Kyler Phillips was the slight favourite here either. With that being said though, I do think there is an argument to why Yadong is the favourite as well. He is a good fighter. I just think the fight should be lined closer, and if you're asking me to pick a value side, I would be picking Kyler Phillips. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, Kyler Phillips was +140, +150 not so long ago. All that money's coming in on him. I do agree with that line movement. It continues to come in on him. Yesterday there was more money coming in on Song Yadong, pushed Kyler Phillips to a bigger underdog, but straight away money came back in. I do think that sort of fluctuation is going to happen throughout fight week, and when these two step into the cage on Saturday night, I think the betting lines are going to be roughly where they're sitting right about now. As for how the fight plays out though, it's a really, really good fight this, and Kyler Phillips is actually one of the most improved fighters that I've seen in recent years in the UFC, because if you look back at his fights outside of the UFC, they're really underwhelming. He doesn't look like he's that great of a fighter, just your average regional scene guy that'll pick up wins. He'll take some losses as well. But since he's come into the UFC, he's just looked like a completely different fighter. His striking is crisp, it's sharp, it comes in volume. He puts a pressure on from the moment the fight starts to the moment the fight ends. His cardio checks out completely. He's dynamic with his kicks. You don't know what strike he's going to throw next. He mixes things up really well with boxing fundamentals and flashy kicks. So he's a hard fighter to read, and he can score takedowns. I think his wrestling is probably his biggest weakness in his game. And I'm not saying he's a bad wrestler. He's not. I just feel that if he got his wrestling to a point where he was completing takedowns more often than not, then he'd be a completely different animal to what he is right now. And the reason for that is his jiu-jitsu. He's a black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, a legit black belt. You see it on the mat. His control topside, his transitions and his grappling from position to position, his submission attempts mixed with ground and pound looking for a finish constantly. He's a really, really difficult fighter to deal with on the mat. Now, when you look at the other side in Song Yadong is also a good fighter himself. I don't think his movement is as erratic. I don't think his volume's as high, but he is very fundamentally and technically sound with his strike, and again mixes things up with his punches, with his kicks. And the one advantage definite advantage he has over Phillips in this fight is the power in his strikes as well. His hands are heavy, his kicks are heavy, and he can hurt his opponent, whereas I don't think Phillips has that type of power to just knock Song Yadong out. I'd be shocked if that happens. Now, Song Yadong's takedown defense is okay as well, and this is where I think the fight's going to get really interesting because, like I said, I don't think Phillips' offensive wrestling is the best. Couple that with Song Yadong having decent takedown defense, I do think that we're going to see a lot of takedown attempts from Phillips that is stuffed by Song Yadong, but I do think that Phillips can get him down eventually. The more he tries, the more he keeps going. He might need to push through the initial takedown attempt and look for a trip with a body lock or something along those sort of lines. That's how Chito Vera got Song Yadong down, and I think Phillips can get him down in the same way as well. Now, I'm unsure of where this fight's actually going to be won and lost because I think we're going to see a true mixed martial arts affair. I think we're going to see plenty of striking with good impact, big action striking. I think that we're going to see wrestling scenarios. I think that we're going to see grappling scenarios, and it's really hard to make a decision of where I feel the biggest action and the biggest impact is going to be in this fight, whether it's going to be in the striking or whether it's going to be down on the mat. But that's actually one of the reasons why I do favour Kyler Phillips in this fight, because I do think that he's better overall than Song Yadong. So the striking's quite close, the wrestling's quite close, the grappling's quite close, but I do think that the pace and the pressure that Phillips puts on in fights is enough to push his opponents back, make his opponents take steps back. That allows Kyler Phillips to look good in the judges' eyes. So if things are even everywhere, then the judges are going to be looking for who's looking to be aggressive, who's looking to gain that octagon control, and I feel that it's going to be Kyler Phillips with all this good movement and the pace and the pressure and the volume. So I think that Kyler Phillips is comfortable wherever this fight goes. I think he's got more paths to victory here as well, because I don't think Song Yadong can use his wrestling and grappling to win this fight. I think Song Yadong's got to use his striking to win this fight, whereas I feel Phillips could use his striking to win this fight, and he could use his wrestling and grappling also. So that's why I think that he's got more paths to victory, and for that reason I'm picking Kyler Phillips to win the fight. And in the next fight, we've got the return of Joe Benavidez versus Askar Askarov. Askarov is currently the -120 favourite to come back on Benavidez at +100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, again, like I said with Cruz, I do feel like there is value at plus money on the fighter that is the UFC veteran, but a fighter that, in my opinion, isn't quite done yet. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there has been some fluctuation. It was Benavidez that opened up the very slight favourite. That line has now flipped, and at plus money you will be seeing money coming in on Benavidez, pushing him to -105, -110, but then money will come back in on Askarov. Ultimately, I do think that Benavidez is going to close as the underdog when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, but I don't see the lines moving too far off from where they're sitting right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's a really interesting fight when you break it down stylistically and you start to look at where this fight's going to be won and lost. Now, admittedly, I've never been massively high on Askarov, but credit where credit is due. He is impressing me the more I see him inside the cage, to the point where I do think that he is a top fighter. I do think he's definitely better than what I thought he was going to be, but there are areas of Askarov's game where I'm just not convinced yet at all, and one of those areas is the striking, and I especially saw that last time out against Pantoja. Askarov was looking to get his wrestling game going, his topside game going. He didn't really want anything to do with the striking of Pantoja, and at that point Pantoja wasn't exactly putting on a high pace and really looking to light Askarov up, so Askarov just clearly didn't want anything to do with the striking, and the moments where Pantoja made him strike, especially towards the end of the fight, it was one punch at a time from Askarov. He didn't look like he put any commitment into any of his strikes to hurt Pantoja either, and I just saw a fighter that just isn't that comfortable striking, and that's really intriguing. Now, the one thing Askarov has got going for him is his wrestling and grappling. He is a good wrestler, he is a good grappler, and that allowed him to get the win against Pantoja. But coming back to where this fight is won and lost, you've got to ask yourself the question: if Askarov is a fighter that leans on his wrestling and grappling to win fights at the top level in the UFC, does he win against Joe Benavidez, wrestling him, taking him down, holding him down? Joe Benavidez can be taken down for sure, but he's one of the best scramblers that we've ever seen in the history of the UFC. It's so hard to keep that dude down. If he is taken down, on his way down to the mat, within the progress of that takedown, he's able to get his scrambling game going, and he's able to get out of positions that you look at and think, how on earth has he managed to get out of those positions? He's so tricky on the mat, he never stays still, he's always looking for an escape, he's always looking to move, and he's just so hard hard to keep down. And with the way the judges are scoring fights right now in this era, they're looking for fighters to really keep top control, really work on top, look for ground and pound, look for submission attempts, and ultimately spend time on top working hard. But that's going to be so difficult to do against Benavidez, and if Askarov can't do that, then the fight is likely going to be determined by what happens in the striking department on the feet. And there is moments, credit to Askarov, where he does look fundamentally sound, where his striking does look okay, but there's so many moments where he is a little inactive on the feet and he doesn't look too comfortable striking. But this is where I feel Benavidez is going to have his advantages, because although he is declined, although he's not as fast as what he once was, I still think that he's got a tremendous amount of speed. I still think his movement in and out of range, in and out of that boxing range, landing combinations, landing hard shots, and exiting out before his opponents can really fire anything back. I really think that that's still a strong element in his game, and I think that's where he's going to get the better of Askarov. So if Askarov is taking Benavidez down 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 or 5 times in the fight, but doesn't do anything with those takedowns, but then Benavidez is really looking good on the feet, it's going to put Benavidez in a really good position to win this fight. I think that his wrestling and scrambling ability is definitely good enough to nullify the path to victory and the game plan that Askarov will put forward in this fight. I think Benavidez will be the better striker. My only concern with Benavidez is from a mental perspective, where is his head at? How motivated is he, knowing that he's probably never going to touch UFC gold or get another championship fight again? But actually, just a quick shout out to James Lynch. He did do an interview with Benavidez and he touched upon all these crucial questions in regards to the mental aspect of where Benavidez is at, and actually there was a lot of positives that I took from that as well. So I'll not spoil the interview, go and see it on James Lynch's YouTube channel. You'll be able to find that interview with Benavidez. So that is my only concern from a mental perspective, but if you take that aside, I think from a stylistic perspective and the fact that I think Benavidez can make this fight won and lost on the feet, and that's where he's better, it's for those reasons I'm picking Joe Benavidez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Rogerio Bontorin versus Kai Kara-France. Kara-France is currently the -140 favourite. The comeback on Bontorin at +120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Bontorin at +120. I think this fight should be much closer to a pick'em, if I'm being honest. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, I actually think we're going to see some fluctuation, but I also see some money coming in on Kai Kara-France as well. Kara-France is one of these fighters that is always popular on the betting line, especially at the -140 line. I think people will see value there, and I think people will think that it'll get the job done against Bontorin. So I think Kai Kara-France will enter the cage -150, -155 come fight night on Saturday night. As for how the fight plays out though, I'm just not convinced of Kai Kara-France. I'm really not. I've been skeptical for a while. I think he's a good fighter, he's got good speed and he's good on the feet, but he allows fights to be so much closer than what they should be, especially when he has a stylistic advantage. And in this fight on the feet, I think by far he's the better technical striker, but he'll wait around a little bit too much. He'll allow Bontorin to close the distance. Bontorin's aggressive. He'll look to come forward at every opportunity. He doesn't mind eating shots to give some himself or to close the distance and try and get the fights down to the mat. I think Kai Kara-France will look good in spells, especially early on, but the longer this fight goes on, I think the style of Bontorin and the fact that he will be looking to be aggressive and close the distance at all times, I think he will slow Kai Kara-France down, and the longer this fight goes on, I do think that Bontorin will grow into it. I think he will be able to score takedowns as well, and he's a good black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on the mat as well. So if Bontorin can get on top of Kai Kara-France, I think he'll be able to spend extended periods of time down there. He could potentially find a submission as well. But with that being said, Bontorin does definitely have to keep being aggressive in this fight. His cardio must check out. He's got to keep trying to close the distance. He's got to keep trying to get takedowns, because if he doesn't, and this does become a kickboxing affair, then that's where Kai Kara-France is better, and at that point his betting line would make much more sense. But this fight's going to be more of a mixed martial arts fight than a kickboxing fight in my opinion. I think Bontorin's going to be able to steal rounds with takedowns and top control. I'm not sure if he'll catch Kai Kara-France with submissions. Kara-France can be a little bit tricky to hold down on the mat and make mistakes and give away a neck or an arm, but I do think Bontorin's going to do good work in this fight. I think there's a big gap in skill in regards to the grappling. I think think that gapping skill is bigger than the gapping skill on the feet. I think Bontorin will be able to hang for moments on the feet, and for those reasons, I'm picking Rogerio Bontorin to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Livia Souza versus Amanda Lemos. Lemos is currently the -225 favourite to come back on Souza at +185 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that Lemos is the rightful favourite for sure, especially when you're analysing this fight and you're breaking it down. But I do think that the betting line has gone a touch too wide here. So if you are asking me for a value side, I would say the value is on the underdog at +185 with Souza. Now, as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we're going to see some money coming back in on Souza, just purely because, like I've already said, I think the line is too wide, but I don't think it's going to go too crazy. I think Lemos is going to come into this fight roughly around the -200 mark. But as for how this fight plays out, I do think that it's really hard to trust Souza right now. She came into the UFC on fire. She smoked Alex Chambers. She looked great against Sarah Frotter. She lost against Brianna Van Buren, which there's no shame in that. Van Buren's a good fighter. But it's in her last fight against Ashley Yoder where I was very, very surprised. Now, Ashley Yoder isn't a bad fighter. She can definitely hang for sure. But the fact that that fight was so close was what surprised me. And Souza, in a lot of people's eyes, didn't win that fight either. So the fact that Souza made that fight close with Yoder, which pre-fight I was thinking she should be much better in a lot of areas, is definitely a concern. Then you get Amanda Lemos, who's looked great lately. She did drop a UFC debut against Leslie Smith, but there's no shame in that, especially for a UFC debut. Since then, she ran through Miranda Granger fairly easily, got her out early in round 1, and then she looked good in her last fight against Mizuki Inoue, who is a fighter that I think is really good as well. She put up good numbers against Inoue, she knocked Inoue down, and she scored a couple of takedowns as well. So Lemos is showing that she is starting to round a game out really well, and she's looking really good in doing so. And that's where I think that Souza's going to have problems here, because Souza's an aggressive fighter. She loves to strike recklessly and wildly, and if that isn't working, or if she wants to mix things up, then she'll look to take the fight down to the mat and use the topside grappling. But the thing is, I think Lemos is definitely going to match her with her striking and aggression. I think Lemos has probably got more power in her hands and her strikes, and I think Lemos is going to be the stronger fighter in the clinch positions as well, and it's those clinch positions where Souza's going to have to be stronger to get a judo game going. She's got a good judo background, so she will be looking for the trips and the throws, but I just don't think that she's going to be able to bully Lemos around in those areas. And if anybody gets on top, I think it's going to be Lemos, and I think that she's going to be able to hang with Souza down on the mat. I think she'll look fine on top of Souza. So I'm having a hard time picking Souza to win this fight, because I just think Lemos is the better striker. Technically, I think she's got more power on the feet as well. I think she mixes things up a little better on the feet. I think she's probably got better wrestling. I think her grappling topside is definitely better as well, and she's going to have physical advantages, in my opinion, with her strength as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Amanda Lemos to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Tim Elliott versus Jordan Espinosa. Espinosa is currently the -125 favourite. The comeback on Elliott at +105 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I would edge towards the value being with the slight favourite Jordan Espinosa at -125. It is a close fight, so I can understand why the odds are close as well, but the value side for me at -125, there's more value there than there is on the plus money with Tim Elliott. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think there's going to be too much movement, and there hasn't been up until this point either. There has been a little bit of money coming in lately on Jordan Espinosa, but I'm not sure how wide that'll get before people just start betting Tim Elliott, because he would become the value side if we saw Elliott at +120 or +125. So I don't think there's going to be too much movement, and ultimately I do see the betting lines being around this sort of price when they step into the cage on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, it's a really interesting fight. As I've already mentioned, it's a close fight as well. You've got Jordan Espinosa that's absolutely going to want to keep this fight on the feet. He's very quick. He's a very active striker, in and out of range. He's got really good movement. And like I say, his strikes come really fast, really good fundamentals. He mixes his punches up with his kicks really well. And ultimately, he's quite dynamic on the feet as well. He can really cause problems when you stand striking with him. And then when you look at Tim Elliott striking, I feel that he's really reckless on the feet. He comes forward in straight straight lines. He has his hands low. He leads with his chin up in the air. He did that against Askarov and nearly got knocked out. So the level of striking defense is where I'm most concerned with Tim Elliott. His striking offense is okay. He's not the most technical striker, but he will come forward. He will look to land aggressively. But the thing is here, because of that striking defense, he's going to get hit a lot as long as this fight is on the feet by Jordan Espinosa. And it wouldn't shock me that if there were extended periods of time on the feet and Espinosa was able to get off strikes if he didn't knock him out. But the thing is with Tim Elliott, he's probably going to look to wrestle here. And this is where Jordan Espinosa is going to have problems himself, because his takedown defense isn't great. Once he's on his back, once he's settled, he can be a little inactive. He can at times show a lack of urgency to get back up to his feet as well. But having said that, Tim Elliott is reckless on the mat as well. He's a really good grappler topside. His scrambles are really good, but he never really stays in the same position for too long. He looks to always transition from position to position. And once he starts transitioning and is going from that position to position, he becomes quite loose on top. And when he becomes loose, he leaves openings for opponents to escape and try and get back up to the feet. So even if he does take Espinosa down, I feel that Espinosa might actually be able to get back up to his feet once Elliott really starts to get his activity going in regards to the grappling. But what makes this fight really close is if Espinosa can get back up to his feet, Tim Elliott can adopt a relentless wrestling game plan where it's just rinse and repeat. He'll take his opponent down, and if they get back up, he'll take them down again. And in between those moments where Elliott's taking him down, if he is adopting that game plan and he does become relentless, what sort of work can Espinosa do on the feet in the striking? Because if Espinosa's doing really nice work on the feet, if he's landing on Elliott, if he's hurting him, if he's putting combinations together, if he's looking like he's really getting into his flow state, then I don't think it'll actually matter too much if Elliott just keeps taking him down and Espinosa keeps standing back up. Because if Espinosa is the one putting in a solid shift on the feet in regards to the striking, then not only is he going to give himself a good chance of knocking Elliott out, but he's also going to look better in the judges' eyes as well. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to happen. I'm not sure that Elliott can just completely roll on Espinosa and, take off 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes per round on top. You've also got to consider the cardio of Tim Elliott, which doesn't look amazing lately. I think Espinosa has got a huge advantage on the feet with the speed, with the power, and as long as he can get back up to his feet without spending too long on his back, wasting minutes on the clock, then I feel that he's going to win this fight, because the judges are going to like what they see from him, and I think he's going to cause Elliott a lot of problems down the stretch. I think he's going to accumulate volume, put power behind his strikes. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jordan Espinosa to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Kennedy and Nzechukwu versus Carlos Ulberg. Ulberg is currently the minus 245 favourite. The comeback on Nzechukwu at plus 205 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I honestly see nothing from tape and looking at the records to suggest that Carlos Ulberg should be a minus 245 favourite here. The line is wide and I just can't justify it. So if you are asking me for a value side, I would say there's more value on Kennedy and Nzechukwu at plus 205 opposed to Carlos Ulberg at minus 245. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I've got a funny feeling Carlos Ulberg's going to end up in a lot of parlays. I think people are going to bet on him just because of who he is, his background, who he trains with, which I'll talk about very shortly. But I do think that money will continue to come in on Ulberg as it is currently right now as well. I think Ulberg will go into the cage minus 275, potentially even minus 300, which would be crazy, but it wouldn't shock me to see that sort of betting line as they step in the cage on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out, as I've just mentioned, who is Carlos Ulberg? Where does he train? Who does he train with? Well, Ulberg's got a kickboxing background. It's not an extensive background, but you can definitely tell that he enjoys that kickboxing base. He trains in New Zealand at City Kickboxing under Eugene Behrman. He trains with Israel Adesanya as well. So I feel like some of this, as I mentioned in the introduction to this breakdown, that it might be baked into the betting line a little bit, because actually when you go and watch tape on Ulberg, I don't think he's a bad fighter. He's got knockout power, but he can be a little inactive. And when I was watching him, I was just thinking to myself, go on, be aggressive, push forward, really show me these kickboxing skills and the skills that you've developed under your coach at City Kickboxing and the fighter that you've turned into, training with all these world-class fighters in one of the best gyms in the world. But you just don't get that from him, and that's what makes me think that the minus 245 betting line is just off, because I'm just wanting to see more from Ulberg really in regards regards to activity and volume. And then the other thing you've got to consider as well is Ulberg's actually only 3-0 as a professional in mixed martial arts. So again, he's very green in regards to MMA. And then you've got Nzechukwu on the other hand, who hasn't really set the world alight in the UFC. He's 1-1. His only win in the UFC was Darko Stosic, who is no longer with the UFC. And let's be honest, I bet Nzechukwu in that fight, and the only reason he won is because he was repeatedly hit to the groin and Stosic was having points taken away from him. Without those groin shots, Stosic would have won the fight and it wouldn't have really been that close. And Stosic is a bit of an inactive fighter as well. And Nzechukwu, again, just like I've said with Ulberg, is a fighter that when I watch, I just want to see more of him. Use your length, use your kicks, be more aggressive. But again, the activity levels just aren't as high as what I think they could be. And it makes this fight really interesting because someone's going to have to pull the trigger. The one thing that I will say for Nzechukwu is we haven't seen him since August 2019. Now, he's a fighter that was obviously very green as well to the eye. So he could have made huge improvements between the last time we saw him to when he steps in the cage on Saturday night. So his volume activity levels might pick up, his skill set might have developed, so there's all these things going on there. But when I'm actually looking at what I've seen in tape, normally I would say, well, the more active guy is probably the guy that's going to win because his opponent is inactive, but actually they're both rather inactive. So you then look at how this fight is won, and to be honest with you, it leads me over to the power, and that's why I do favour Ulberg to win this fight slightly, because I do think Ulberg has definitely got more power than Nzechukwu has. Ulberg does have a kickboxing background, so from a technical striking standpoint, you've got to assume that Ulberg is going to be the better striker inside the cage. So the fact that Ulberg's got a power advantage, the fact that he's going to be the better technical striker and he has the kickboxing background, and the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet unless one of them has turned into a beast wrestler, which is just very unlikely. So I do have to favour Ulberg here. So I'm picking Carlos Ulberg to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Sean Brady versus Jake Matthews. Sean Brady is currently the -210 favourite. The comeback on Matthews at +175 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the betting line's pretty fair if I'm being honest. So at -210 from Sean Brady's perspective, I don't see too much value there, and I don't really see too many reasons to hop on to Jake Matthews at +175 either. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, I do think people will jump on this +175 with Jake Matthews. Matthews is an established UFC fighter and he's caused upsets in the past when he's been plus money in other spots, so I think people might be interested in the +175. So I think the Matthews money will come in. I think the line will shorten a little bit. I'm not sure how short it can get. Like, I'd be surprised to see -175 on Brady, but I do see some Matthews money coming in, and I do see the line shortening just a little bit before these two step into the cage on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, it's interesting because I feel that both fighters are very similar with the styles and the skill set as well, and their abilities. So with both fighters being very similar, it does beg the question why the fight isn't a -110 pick and why Brady is a moderate favourite here. And I think the reason being is, although both fighters are similar in regards to their styles and their abilities, I just think Brady edges Jake Matthews in pretty much every area. And normally in those fights where you do get two similar fighters but one guy slightly better everywhere, it does bring a much wider betting line than some people might expect. But for me, I do think that Brady is a prospect in the UFC. I do think he's a future top 10, top 15 at least. But I really like Sean Brady and his style. I think he's built really well for the division. He's short, he's stacked, he's got good striking, good boxing. He mixes in kicks with his punches as well. Good combinations, he's aggressive, but he can also fight on the front foot and fight on the back foot. He's got decent wrestling. He's a Daniel Gracie Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt as well, which is legit. And you can really see that level of Jiu-Jitsu, that level of control, and his submission attempts as well. He's got a nasty guillotine. And then you hear the endorsement from other fighters like Paul Felder, who trains with him and says that Sean Brady is the strongest guy that he's ever felt in the gym. So there's a lot of upside for Brady in my opinion. Jake Matthews is a good fighter himself. He can be a little underwhelming at times, and against Rostam Akman, for for example, that fight was just, as I've just said, underwhelming. He didn't really go out there and perform and take it from Ackman when Matthews was the better fighter. Matthews in that spot was the Brady in this spot. Matthews was just better than Rostam Ackman everywhere, and he just really didn't put it on him. But then the one thing with Jake Matthews that really does throw me is every now and again he'll come out with just a phenomenal performance when you least expect it. The performance against Li Jingliang was one that comes to mind. Matthews wasn't looking great up until that point. A lot of people bet Li Jingliang in that spot, myself included, and Matthews just came out and looked phenomenal. So there's always that chance, and he hasn't looked too great in his last few fights, so this might be one of the fights he comes out and looks phenomenal in, but I just can't pick against Sean Brady right now. I think Brady, as I've already mentioned, is better everywhere. I think his skill set's solid. He's a winner. He doesn't look like he ever gives up on himself. He looks like he constantly pushes forward. He can take a shot as well. I just feel that wherever this fight goes, Brady can look good against Jake Matthews, and for that reason I'm picking Sean Brady to win this fight. And in the next fight we've got the newcomer Uros Medic versus Alon Cruz. Medic is currently the -165 favourite. The comeback on Cruz at +145 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, honestly I think the value is with the underdog in Alon Cruz. I think that he's the more proven fighter. I think his sample size is greater, and you've just seen more of him. There's not too much tape out there of Medic. Medic has only been out of round 1 once as well, and that's always a red flag in these kind of fights. So I think the value is with the underdog, given he's +145 against what I've just described with Medic. And as for where the betting line moves, I think it's quite settled at the minute. I don't see too much movement throughout fight week. There could be a little bit of money coming in on either side, but I don't think that fluctuation is enough to really sway this betting line one way or another. Come fight night on Saturday night, I do expect the betting lines to be sitting roughly where we're at right about now. As for how the fight plays out though, I think the fight's won and lost on the feet. I think that's pretty much a given. Medic is a kickboxer. Alon Cruz is a kickboxer. They both love to strike. They're both aggressive on the feet. They're both really heavy with the kicks. I think Medic's hands are much better than Cruz's, but I think the length of Cruz and the unorthodox nature of his attacks and his kicks could pose some problems for Medic as well. But it just becomes a fact that we haven't seen what Medic is like when he gets stretched, when he gets put into deep waters. If this fight goes into round 3 with rounds 1 and 2 being really fast paced, a lot of action, a lot of volume, what's Medic going to be like? Nobody knows because nobody's seen it. So it's just really hard to be confident in Medic. But when you're looking on the side of Alon Cruz, sure, he got knocked out in round 1 against Spike Carlisle, but knockouts happen. This is the game. This is the fight game. You can't put too much stock into round 1 knockouts when the fighter who has been knocked out hasn't really got too much history with being knocked out either. So what I do know about Alon Cruz is that he can keep up a high pace. He can go 3 rounds. He can find a finish late in a fight. So that has to give me every reason to pick him here. I think Medic is a good fighter from what I've seen, but again, the level of competition and the fact that he hasn't gone deep definitely worries me, and I just cannot pick him to win this fight for those reasons. So I'm picking Alon Cruz to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Mario Batista versus Trevin Jones. This is a short notice fight for Mario Batista, and it's actually Batista that's the -235 favourite. The comeback on Jones at +195 as the underdog. And as for where the value is on the betting line, I don't see any value in -235 for Batista coming into this fight on short notice. But on the flip side, he does look to be the better fighter in this fight, so I don't see a great deal of value in Jones at +195 either. But if you are going to push me for a value side, I would say that Jones at +195 holds more value than Batista at -235. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, it does seem to be the current trend that the money's coming in on Batista, and it really wouldn't shock me too much if we saw Batista close very close to -300. I'm not sure if it actually hits that -300, but like I say, I think it's going to be in that region come fight night on Saturday night. As for how this fight plays out though, it's going to be a striking battle. I think Batista's going to come out. I think he's going to be aggressive. Trevin Jones should meet him in that respect. Jones likes to sit down on his punches, throw hands, he mixes in his kicks well, but Batista's just the more dynamic fighter here. I think he's going to be the faster fighter here. He's the one that'll land more volume, and that's ultimately why I can't pick Trevin Jones to win this fight, because for a fight that I think is won and lost on the feet, when you've got a guy like Batista that has better technical striking, has more volume, he is faster, and he's more experienced, fought the far better competition out the two fighters, it's really hard not to pick that fighter to win. Short notice is a bit of a concern, but I can't pick against Mario Batista in this type of fight. Stylistically, it favours him, and I think he's got a lot of advantages, so I'm picking Mario Batista to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Money Line. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again, guys, I'd appreciate all likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMAPlay365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which is free every week, by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they're all at very affordable prices too. Just hop onto MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.